Welcome back to Reimagining Cyber, and today we're talking about the newly released Verizon 2026 Data Breach Investigations Report, or DBIR. It's one of the industry's biggest annual reports, and this year there's a finding that might surprise people. Now, for years we've talked about identity being the new perimeter, and that attackers aren't always breaking in anymore, they're logging in. But Verizon's latest data shows vulnerability exploitation has become the most common initial access vector for breaches. Now, with me to talk about this is Tyler Moffitt. Tyler, how are you doing?
Good. Thanks for having me on. Appreciate it. Glad to talk about this one for sure.
Yeah, so the first big question then, I suppose, is does this contradict what we've been saying all along?
No, I don't think it does. I think the most important thing, definitely want to clear up right away. I still believe identity is the new perimeter, and I don't think, the industry also agrees with that. And that's what you hear when you go to all these conferences. Attackers are still absolutely logging in, stolen credentials, phishing, session theft. I mean, AI is helping all of that. MFA fatigue. It's still all like a huge, massive problem, right? But what the DBIR report is reminding us is that identity is not the only door, okay? I would say identity is the new perimeter, but vulnerability management is still the unlocked window. So, this is not identity vs patching. It's both. They both matter. Attackers are going to take like the path of least resistance, right? Whatever's the easiest path available. And if that is, you've left the back door wide open because you didn't patch something that came out last month, that's the way they're going to come in, right? Sometimes it's a stolen password though, right? But other times, like we've seen, especially with some of these ransomware, it's like an unpatched VPN appliance, firewall, web app, file transfer, you name it. With AI and automation, though, that window basically gets found a lot faster now.
Okay, then let's start with the actual headline. What stood out to you from this year's DBIR?
I would say the biggest thing is the exploitation of vulnerabilities is now the most common initial access vector in their breach data set. They put it at 31% for, which is, quite large. I mean, to be almost a third of all the different types of attack vectors. And previously it had actually been credential abuse, which is what we're talking about, but that had dropped to 13% now, which is a pretty big shift. But I wouldn't read that as credentials don't matter anymore. It's more the attack surface is getting punished. Organizations have way more and more internet-facing systems, more SaaS, more cloud, third-party software, remote access tools, you name it. And attackers are very good at finding the one that you forgot to, update or patch, right? With that many more devices, you've got that much more management you've got to worry about. And the DBIR also says, like, the critical vulnerabilities, right? Those scores from CISA, right? Only 26% of those were fully remediated in 2025, which is down from 38% the year before. That's a huge change. And the median time to resolution rose to 43 days, up from 32 days. That's the biggest problem, is attackers are moving faster and defenders are taking longer.
So it's not just the vulnerabilities. Let's face it, they've always been there. It's the fact that I guess they've been magnified by that the gap between disclosure and exploitation.
Yeah, no, like you said, vulnerabilities have always been there. That's never been something people haven't been talking about, and we talk about it a lot in like cybersecurity vegetables and just cyber resilience and posture. It's becoming more and more important. It's still becoming something that we talk about. And I mentioned it even as like, one of the top things people need to understand and realize. Patching has always been a pain, right? It's not new. What's new is the speed, right? The DBIR report basically says that, some of these things have changed. And it's like, more about speed and scale now, right? Honestly, that's modern cybercrime right now with AI and how we've seen the speed and scale. It's not really brand new tactics. It's the old stuff is happening faster and larger with better scaling, right? Better targeting. And that's where AI is helping it, right? It's not like AI has already become autonomous and it's now ones and zeros hacker hoodie coming after you. It's more just helping the bad guys scale, lowering the bar of entry in knowledge. It's helping all of them. It's literally helping them find the exploits, analyze the vulnerabilities, write the exploit logic, troubleshoot the code, generate the phishing, and just move faster through all of the boring stuff that, used to be tedious and require somebody very, very skilled. You now don't need the bar of entry is lower.
Let's come back to the identity point then, because I think a lot of listeners have heard us say attackers aren't breaking in, they're logging in. But how do we say that now without sounding like we're contradicting ourselves?
Well, it's both, to be honest. I know this report says, hey, lean more on vulnerabilities versus identity. But, it's attackers aren't breaking in, they're logging in is still true in a lot of cases, right? But it was never supposed to mean every breach starts with credentials. It means that identities basically become one of the most important control planes in security. And if attackers have valid credentials, especially privileged credentials, they can bypass a lot of traditional defenses, right? They look like a user, they've used approved tools, they access real systems, and Verizon's data adds another half to the picture, that attackers are also breaking in through exposed systems that haven't been patched, which has always been there, right? So I would say, realigning it, if you will, that attackers are either logging in with stolen identity or breaking through exposed infrastructure. You have to defend both. It's not like pick one or the other that you want to watch. You've got both to watch. The surface area of attack is always growing. It feels like getting worse. We just talked about the stats they have as far as gaps. Not only are they quicker to finding these and quicker to exploiting them, but the time in which it takes somebody to patch is going longer. This is bad, and it's absolutely something that should be talked about, because if the gap is growing longer and how long it takes for you guys to patch, then yeah, they're going to exploit that. That's a more dwell time for them to leverage to get back in. So, and these paths, honestly, they connect, right? Vulnerability gets them initial access, then they get to steal credentials, and then once stolen credentials onto the system, that allows them to exploit internal weaknesses or escalate privileges, move laterally. I mean, it's not two separate worlds. It's one attack chain.
Why is patching still such a big problem? We've been talking about patch management forever.
Honestly, I agree with you. It's easy to say, just patch, guys. But it's really hard to operationalize, especially with large organizations. I mean, a lot of companies, they don't even know everything they own. They're throwing more and more devices and stuff, on their networks. They have no idea about some of these edge devices. I mean, you can't patch what you don't know exists, right? And then you add cloud assets, SaaS apps, shadow IT, like remote workers, third-party tools, the list goes on as to all the many reasons as to why you add stuff that needs patches that you don't even have an inventory on, right? And
the unknown unknowns.
Right, exactly. And especially for small to medium-sized businesses, it can be even harder because they don't even have dedicated security teams or nowhere near the same budgets and team layout that enterprises does, right? They might just have a single IT person or rely on an MSP, and they're dealing with backups, tickets, onboarding, printers, email issues, compliance, everything. Stuff that sort of drowns out patching as an afterthought. And this is where specifically in the report, the SMB section is useful here, because it says, small organizations are disproportionately impacted by ransomware and face many of the same threats as larger organizations, but with fewer resources. And, the exploitation of vulnerabilities at 26%, and, credential abuse 13%, and phishing at 19%. So you could say vulnerabilities and exploiting at 26%, and then the identity part at 20%. So that's 26 and 20. That's almost half are those two things we talked about, identity and patching. So I would say, the real world problem here, especially with SMBs, is they face enterprise grade threats without enterprise grade staffing or budget.
Yeah, that's something actually we went into a couple of episodes ago, episode 201, if you want to check it out, called the SMB Cyber Wake Up Call, featured MK Palmore. We did touch on that kind of theme. It's well worth a listen. And it isn't just a technical issue, is it, for SMBs? It's a capacity issue.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's why prioritization matters. Nobody patches anything instantly or as soon as it comes up, right? There's still a gap there. You want to reduce that gap as quickly as you can, but the question becomes, what is internet facing? What is known exploited? What is business critical? What has active threat intelligence around it? What would give an attacker a path to sensitive data, or identity. Vulnerability management basically needs to move from we've scanned and made a giant spreadsheet to we know what matters first and have priority list here and prioritized it.
Let's talk about AI. We have to. We're obliged to. You mentioned it earlier. How does AI change this?
Yeah, it's the scale and the speed, right? It compresses the timeline. It helps attackers move from, hey, there's a vulnerability to here's how I exploit it. Here's the proof of concept, and here's how I turn that into leverage into an attack, right? Recon, code analysis, exploit development, malware changes. We even talked about how AI has already helped find and write exploit development. I think in episode 202, right after that was coming out. And so that's definitely interesting, right? They're using Gen AI to help choose targets, gain a foothold, develop malware and tools now. It feels like that the patch window is sort of dead, and that may seem dramatic, but the old comfort window that you used to have from receiving these CISA reports of what's critical 9 vulnerability or above, that might be gone now, right? You can't assume you've got weeks or months to deal with that serious exposed vulnerability, because if it's internet facing, as soon as it comes out, they're going to be notified because of AI tools. They're going to start trying to leverage it immediately. So that's reducing down to days now, potentially even less than days. I don't know. The clock's running, right? It's already running.
So to kind of sum up that, I guess, AI doesn't create a totally new category of risk. It kind of accelerates existing risk, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's compressing the timelines. It's making they're scaling the criminals faster, right? It's not replacing cybercrime or coming up with new ways. It's just making existing cybercrime and attack methods more efficient.
Okay,
right?
let's start with
Lowers
the
the skill barrier.
Then.
Talked
what
about that.
Stood out to
Speeds
you
up research. Helps mediocre attackers basically just punch way above their weight. And it helps good attackers scale really fast. And so defenders have to use it too, right? It's not magic. It's for triage, prioritization, summarization, detection engineering, threat hunting, vulnerability analysis, and response. It's going to help in all those areas.
I guess ransomware must have fitted somewhere into this year's report. What was brought up?
Yeah, it's everywhere. Ransomware is the big, sexy threat all the time. I think the DBIR report specifically said ransomware, 48% of all breaches. So basically half, okay? And that's up from 44% in the year. So it's still nice growth there. I mean, that's 10% year over year growth. And the interesting part is that ransomware payments actually do continue to decline, with 69% of ransomware victims basically not paying, which is a good sign. But it doesn't mean ransomware is going away. And we've always talked about this, how I've covered all the time in threat reports, and how, ultimately we saw, I think 2019, 85% of people were paying the ransom because they were just completely owned by it. And now, from the data we were seeing, is it was 22% are not paying. So a little different from the data they have, but obviously they're analyzing different breaches and different, telemetry and networks and devices, but it's pretty close to what we're seeing as well. And it basically just means organizations, maybe getting better at refusing payment. Attackers are shifting tactics. Victims are relying more on recovery, maybe getting better with tabletop exercises. But obviously ransomware is still one of the most disruptive outcomes, right? And it all ties back to, how do they get in? What's the initial access? Ransomware crews, they don't care whether they get in through a stolen password or from identity or phishing or unpatched appliance, right? All they care is that they got in.
So the entry point changes, but the end game is often the same.
Yeah. Initial access is the doorway, right? Ransomware is the monetization, right? Getting in your foot in the door, getting a foothold, that's important. Going from one machine to multiple machines, moving laterally. Usually you got to get domain level credentials to do that. And so they sit on that one machine maybe for a little while and wait to get that access. But the last stage noisy payload is always going to be, usually ransomware, right? That's the turn my breach into money, right? And so that usually means crypto, sending me, Bitcoin, Monero, whatever type of crypto they want at this point. But, and for, especially for small to medium sized businesses, this can be brutal, right? A large enterprise might be able to absorb some downtime, an SMB might not. And in many cases, we've done some analysis. It can be like the death knell and potentially be, the outage, depending on the severity, is existential. And so that's why it always comes back to resilience, right? Prevention matters, recovery matters too, backups, testing your restores, segmentation, incident response plans, your tabletop exercises, doing all of that stuff, right? Not we have backups somewhere. You want to prove that you can recover, know how to recover, have regularly done it, so that way when it's the time comes, because it's the assumption. The good posture is the assumption of when, not if, right? That's the most important part.
Okay, let's move on now to what the report says about third-party risk. How does it fit into this conversation?
Yeah, third-party risk is basically the attack surface you don't fully control. It's always been a concern. Every company relies on vendors, SaaS providers, MSP, file transfer tools, cloud. It doesn't end. APIs, integrations, the AI, everybody, they're loading up more. And so this creates, efficiency, but it also creates dependency and more attack surface, right? So the DBIR report specifically calls out the growing role of third parties in security posture and the risks that they involved. And they had third party show up as 55% of breaches. Just they were involved in over half of all breaches. And that's huge, right? Because a company can do a lot right internally with all their posture, but then still be exposed through someone else's lack of posture, right? And this is where identity and vulnerability management overlap again. Third-party risk can be a vulnerable product, right? It can be a vendor account with too much access. Both of these are dangerous.
So vendor risk isn't just a questionnaire problem.
Yeah, I know no one wants to hear that, but questionnaires are not enough. Questionnaires are annoying as it is. But you need to know exactly what vendors have access to, what systems are exposed, what software is deployed, how quickly these patches are applied. Like, do you really need to go and look up vulnerabilities and go, does my third party, know about this? Have they patched it yet? But some people are going to be thinking that way, right? It's difficult. What happens if a vendor gets compromised? It's not glamorous, but that's where the real security lives.
And the DBIR also seems to come back to fundamentals. Would you say that that's fair?
Yeah, no, and I always talk about that. So I appreciate that. It's after my own heart. The report's intro basically says the overarching theme is keeping a strong foundation in the face of change, and then talks about clear visibility into assets and third parties, disciplined patch management, practice response plans, the culture that supports secure behavior. So security posture. And that's the part, it's probably boring. People don't really want to hear it. But the answer isn't always some shiny new tool you add to your stack. It's knowing what you own, knowing who has access, patching what matters, enforcing MFA, reducing privilege, you don't want too much tool sprawl, the token access, the length of time. Monitoring behavior, testing recovery, training users, having a plan, testing the plan. These basics are, they're not basic because they're easy. They're basic because everything else depends on them.
And I can imagine security teams just being a bit frustrated because it sounds like the same advice every single year.
It is the same advice, but the environment keeps changing to make that advice reinforce. It's like, I don't know, it's like saying wear a seatbelt. The advice doesn't become outdated because cars got faster or a little safer in crumple zone technology or whatever. It's still important. Patching, identity, backups, visibility, segmentation, response. These are all the seatbelts. I guess you just got to wear all the seatbelts. And AI and automation just made the cars a lot faster. And so you want to wear all the seatbelts.
Let's turn this into practical steps. If someone is listening, an organization is listening and thinking, what do I actually do with this? Where should they be starting?
It's a good question. I guess try to break it down to 5 things here. First, know what's exposed, right? Start with your internet-facing assets, right? Firewalls, remote access, web apps, file transfer, literally anything. If attackers can scan it, you know, then you need to know it exists. Second, prioritize the exploited vulnerabilities, right? Obviously, not every CVE out there is equal, right? They do have a ranking system, and so you're going to know which ones are critical business systems and vulnerabilities that enable remote code execution or privilege escalation. Those are top tier. Those are the solve right now. Stay late if you need to take care of it. Third would be like lockdown identity. We've talked about phishing resistant, MFA where possible, least privileged access, conditional access, disable stale accounts, monitor privileged users, impossible travel, suspicious OAuth grants, like the standard stuff we've always talked about. The fundamentals, really. Four, reduce blast radius, right? Definitely want to have some sort of segmentation, like EDR, DNS filtering, email security, backup isolation. Just the assumption that, if something gets in, make sure it can't easily just grab everything. A lot of the times in these attacks, it can take days or weeks before they turn one machine compromise into full network compromise. And the most success I've seen is people stopping it there, where they know a machine has been infected and they prevent it from escalation and lateral moving. And then are able to remediate eventually from that one machine and get it out. That's how a lot of success stories would be. Yes, you did technically get infected in your environment, but you turned it from just being, you turned it away from one machine into being the entire network or something catastrophic, and that's huge, right? Being able to reduce blast radius is I think underrated for sure. I guess lastly, testing the recovery. Not, we have backups, or test the restores. Do the dry run scenarios, right? Know your tabletop exercises, right? Know who makes the decisions during an incident and how you communicate. Even if email is down, right? You want to have some sort of chain of communication and knowing your process if something like that were unavailable.
That is an awful lot of steps to take, and like came up earlier on, it's an awful lot if you're an SMB.
Yeah, no, I mean, you have to realize like SMBs, they need prioritization and often need help. But you'd rather have an SMB do 5 boring things well than buy 10 tools that they don't have the time to manage that could just be a surface area of attack. I mean, if you don't know what's exposed and you don't patch critical systems, you don't have backups or enforce MFA, like, you're gambling.
For MSPs listening then, how should they use this report with customers?
It's a great customer conversation starter because it's not, vendor FUD. Verizon's DBIR is sort of like agnostic, if that makes sense. Like, your risk is not just phishing anymore. The latest data breach report shows vulnerability exploitation is now climbed to the top initial access vector. It means we need to look at exposed systems, patching speed, identity controls, and recovery altogether. I guess, like, to sum it up and simplify it, MSPs, this creates a reason to talk about like asset discovery, vulnerability prioritization, patching, MFA and identity hardening, backup testing, incident response, security awareness, like MDRs, managed detection, third-party access reviews. I mean, this is all stuff that isn't new, but it needs to be discussed. It needs to be covered, and it can't roll your eyes at it. The message isn't you need everything. It should be, here are the most likely ways attackers get in, and here's how we reduce your odds.
So it becomes a business risk conversation, not just a technical one.
Most business owners really don't care about CVE numbers. I mean, they should, but they don't. They just care about downtime, data loss, payroll, customer trust, insurance, legal exposure, and whether they, can operate tomorrow. So, don't lead with whatever CVE-49, whatever. They don't care. Lead with, here are the unlocked windows in your business, and here's what we're doing about them.
Speak to them in a language they understand, essentially.
Yep.
Now, if listeners remember one thing from this episode, what should it be? It's the question I always ask you.
Yeah, identity is the new perimeter, but vulnerability management is still the unlocked window. I'd say that's the summary for the whole episode, to be honest. Attackers are still logging in, but they're also exploiting exposed systems. And once they're in, those paths basically merge, right? They steal credentials, move laterally, escalate, disable defenses, exfiltrate data for a leak site, look at your financial statements so you can't play games with them when it comes time for a ransomware. So, don't turn this into identity versus patching. Definitely the wrong debate. The key takeaway here is that the fundamentals are converging, right? Know your assets, patch what matters, protect identity, reduce privilege, monitor behavior and token access, API access, segment your environments, and test your recovery tabletop exercises. And do it faster than before because AI and automation are compressing that timeline.
Tyler, fantastic stuff as always. Thanks for walking us through it.
Thanks for having me on, Ben. This was a really important one. Lots, jam-packed with info on this one. And for any listening, if you've not heard of the DBIR from Verizon, it's one of the few annual reports, definitely worth your time. It's not just a scary list of stats, read it as a map of where your basics could be failing, because that's where attackers are going to go first.
Tyler, fantastic. Thanks again.
And thanks to you for listening. Tyler and I will be back next week. So subscribe to the show and you'll be able to hear us wherever you get your podcasts. Goodbye.